Padre Pio looked at the man standing before him in the confession line, and something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not pity, something far heavier than either. A knowing that no living person should have to carry alone. He said, quietly in Italian, "You have 40 days." The man laughed nervously. He thought it was a spiritual number. 40, like the days of Lent, 40 years in the desert, 40 as a symbol of trial and purification. He walked away, smiling. 40 days later, he was in the ground, but here is what almost no one who tells that story ever mentions. That man had been warned before, not by Padre Pio, by his own conscience. For 23 years, he had told himself the same thing. I will go to confession when I am ready, when the children are grown, when things slow down. I will make my peace with God at the end. He had 40 days, and he did not use a single one of them. That is what this video is about, not death. Death is certain for all of us, and there is nothing in death that needs to frighten a prepared soul. This video is about the one lie that more souls believe than any other. The lie that conversion can be scheduled, that repentance is something you can pencil in for later, that God's mercy is a door that stays open regardless of how long you wait, regardless of how many times you walk past it without entering. Padre Pio spent 53 years in that confessional booth in San Giovanni Rotondo. He heard confessions from hundreds of thousands of people who came from every country in the world. He saw their souls, not metaphorically, not poetically. He saw the actual spiritual state of each person with a supernatural clarity that the Church has formally acknowledged. And in all those decades, there was one pattern he returned to again and again when he spoke to his closest spiritual sons and daughters. One error so common, so deadly and so invisible to the person who holds it, that he called it the most dangerous deception of the modern soul. It is the lie of the deathbed. Let me tell you something most people do not realize. Padre Pio never once said that deathbed conversion was easy. He never once said that waiting was spiritually safe. What he said, in letters, in private confessions, in conversations recorded by those around him, was something far more sobering than what you will hear in most homilies today. And I'm going to tell you exactly what he said, because it changes everything about how you should be living right now, not 40 years from now. I've been studying Padre Pio's writings for over 30 years, since I first picked up a small pamphlet at a Catholic retreat in Coventry when I was in my late 20s. I remember sitting in the chapel that afternoon, the rain coming down on those tall stone windows, reading about this strange priest in southern Italy who could read souls. And I thought to myself, if a man like that looked at me right now, what would he see? I was not living a terrible life, but I was not living honestly either. I had my own small ledger of things postponed, things avoided, things I had quietly decided to address at some later and more convenient point in my spiritual life. And that question, what would he see? Never left me. I think it is the right question for every one of us to sit with seriously, because that question, honestly engaged, is itself a form of grace. In 1954, a man named Antonio Ferrante stood at what would turn out to be a crossroads of his spiritual life, though he did not recognize it as such. He was 56 years old, a prosperous cloth merchant from Naples, a man known in his neighborhood for his generosity at Christmas, for funding the restoration of the local parish roof, for greeting the priest after Sunday Mass with a firm handshake and a substantial envelope. By every outward measure, Antonio was a good Catholic. He attended Mass every Sunday without fail. He said grace at every meal. He had raised his children in the faith. He kept a small crucifix above the door of his shop. But his wife, Maria, knew otherwise. Maria Ferrante was a woman of extraordinary interior life. She had prayed the full 15 decades of the Rosary every morning since she was 7 years old, had made a pilgrimage to Fatima twice, and had once, during a particularly heated argument with Antonio over certain business dealings that touched on his conscience more than he admitted, walked the 14 stations of the cross barefoot on the cold stone floor of their parish church. She loved her husband with the kind of love that endures precisely because it refuses to look away. And what she saw clearly was this: Antonio had not been to confession in 11 years. It was not that he had abandoned the faith. He attended Mass, he received communion, which Maria often reflected with a particular quality of holy dread, made the situation worse rather than better. He gave to the poor. He was faithful to her in every obvious sense, but confession was, in his own words, for when he had something serious to confess. He had constructed, over 11 years, an elaborate private theology of his own goodness, a ledger in which his charitable acts cancelled out his smaller sins, a quiet conviction that his general decency served as a kind of ongoing and self-renewing absolution. He had read somewhere, in one of the many popular articles about Padre Pio that were circulating in Italian Catholic homes in those years, that the stigmatist friar had offered his life for the conversion of sinners, and in the particular way that self-deceived people have of using the most beautiful truths to serve the most comfortable lies, Antonio had concluded, "Padre Pio is taking care of it. I do not need to take care of it myself." Maria wrote a letter to Padre Pio in September of 1954. She described her husband with unflinching precision, the kind of honest description that only genuine love is capable of, because it refuses both harshness and flattery. She wrote about the 11 years of absent confession, about the communions received in a state she feared might be one of mortal sin, about Antonio's habit of saying, and the letter preserved these words exactly, "I will sort everything out at the end, when the moment comes. God knows my heart." She asked Padre Pio to pray for her husband. She asked if there was anything she herself should do to help him. She sealed the letter and sent it to the friary at San Giovanni Rotondo and waited. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived. She opened it, standing at her kitchen table in Naples, the late afternoon light coming through the window that overlooked the courtyard where the fig tree her father had planted was still bearing fruit. The letter was short. Padre Pio was known for brevity, but what it contained made her set it down on the table very carefully, sit down slowly in the chair, and not speak for the rest of that evening. Hold on, because what Padre Pio wrote in that letter is one of the most sobering things I have encountered in 30 years of studying his life, and it is directly relevant to every person watching this right now. Not just to Antonio, not just to those who have not been to confession in a decade, but to all of us, because the warning he gave Maria is one he repeated in different forms to different people across 50 years of priestly ministry. I need you to stay with me through the context, because without the context, the sentence loses most of its weight. Padre Pio wrote to Maria, "Your husband believes that mercy is patient because he is patient. He has confused God's silence for God's acceptance. The door of mercy is open, this is true, but the soul that waits too long may find that it no longer knows how to walk through it." That last sentence, let it settle. The soul that waits too long may find that it no longer knows how to walk through it. This was not a theological abstraction written from the comfort of a study. Padre Pio was describing a spiritual mechanism he had observed directly, in living souls, and by his own account in the souls of the dead who came to him seeking prayers. Over 5 decades of uninterrupted mystical experience. He was describing what happens to the human heart when it is repeatedly, deliberately, and habitually placed before the door of grace and chooses to walk past it, not once, not twice, but as a settled practice, a lifestyle. To understand this properly, we need to understand something about how the soul functions, not according to the sentimental popular theology of our era, which has largely reduced God's mercy to an unconditional guarantee that costs the receiving soul nothing, but according to the authentic Catholic tradition that Padre Pio embodied more completely than perhaps any other saint of the 20th century. In spiritual theology, there is a concept known as the hardening of the heart. It is not simply a poetic metaphor. It is a description of an actual spiritual process with observable effects. Every time a soul genuinely recognizes the need for conversion and refuses it, not from ignorance, but from a deliberate turning away, that refusal leaves a mark. Augustine wrote about it with personal intimacy. Thomas Aquinas analyzed the mechanism with a physician's precision. But Padre Pio saw it in real time, in the faces and souls of the people who stood before him in that confessional. And what he saw again and again in those who had delayed for years and decades was a specific deterioration, not of intelligence or ordinary virtue, a deterioration of the soul's interior capacity for the particular movement that repentance requires. The mechanics of repentance were still present, the prayers, the words, the gestures, but the interior movement that gives those mechanics their spiritual life had become sluggish, reluctant, calcified, like a joint that has not been moved in years. The joint is still there, but moving it hurts in ways that movement never used to hurt. A man could kneel at a deathbed, repeat the words of an act of contrition, and be technically absolved. The Church provides for this. But the depth of that contrition, the genuine horror at having offended God, the true and interior determination of amendment could be so shallow, so thin, so mechanically produced by a frightened man trying to cover his bets at the last moment, that the absolution touches only the surface of a soul that has spent 40 years deliberately choosing itself over God in every small and medium and large decision of its life. Padre Pio was warning Maria about her husband, but he was also warning every priest who reads letters like hers, and every person who carries, somewhere in the back of their mind, the comfortable assumption that the accounting can always be deferred. This is what truly matters, and I want to say it with the gentleness it deserves, because I know how these words land when you are thinking of someone you love who has been making this particular choice for years. The danger is not that God refuses mercy to the dying. God never refuses. The mercy of God is more vast, more tenacious, more patient than any of us can fully comprehend. The danger is that we ourselves refuse God so often, so habitually for so long, that when the final moment arrives and the full weight of eternity presses down on the soul and the ordinary human defenses and distractions are no longer available, we find ourselves face to face with the door and no longer capable of the wholehearted surrender that genuine repentance requires. I learned this not from a book, but from sitting at the bedside of a woman named Agnes, my neighbor in Coventry, for nearly 20 years in the final weeks of her life. Agnes was not a woman who had lived badly. She had been kind. She had been generous. She had attended church sporadically and had always intended, in some genuine and non-hypocritical way, to attend more regularly, to get back to the sacraments, to have the conversation she kept meaning to have with the priest. She had simply never gotten around to it. When her cancer reached the stage where getting around to things was no longer possible, I sat with her many evenings in that small room that smelled of antiseptic and cut flowers. And what I witnessed in those weeks, the particular quality of her struggle in those last days, was something that no amount of reading about it had prepared me for. She was not without faith. She was not hardened in any dramatic sense. But she had, over a lifetime of small deferrals, developed a deep unfamiliarity with the interior act of surrender. When the priest came, she held his hand and wept. But in those final nights, when I sat with her alone, she said something that I have never forgotten. She said, "I know the words. I just don't know if I'm saying them right anymore. I've been away too long. I've forgotten the feeling. Back to Antonio and Maria Ferrante. There is something in Padre Pio's letter that I have not yet told you, because it changes the shape of the story. Padre Pio did not only write that warning about the soul that can no longer walk through the door. He also wrote, at the very end of the letter, 3 words that must have felt simultaneously like a command and an act of mercy. Tell your husband to come to me. Antonio was not a man given to pilgrimages. He was a merchant, practical, busy, disinclined toward the kind of dramatic spiritual gesture that he associated privately with a more excitable type of Catholic than himself. When Maria showed him the letter, he read it twice, standing in the doorway of his study. He folded it carefully and placed it in the inside breast pocket of his jacket. He did not say anything to Maria about it that evening. He did not say anything about it the next morning. He carried the letter with him for 4 months. During those 4 months, something began happening to Antonio that he did not mention to Maria at first, something that only emerged later in a conversation she preserved in her diary. He began having a recurring dream, not a nightmare, nothing terrible, no sulfur or fire, just a door. A heavy wooden door he recognized from somewhere, perhaps from his childhood parish church, standing alone in a featureless white space, slightly ajar. In the dream, Antonio would walk toward it, reach for the handle, and then stop, not because anything prevented him, but because in the logic of the dream, he could no longer remember why he had wanted to open it in the first place. The intention was there. The movement toward the door was there. But the reason had dissolved. He would wake from this dream with the feeling that something had been decided without him. He carried the letter for 4 months, and then, in February of 1955, Antonio Ferrante traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo. What happened when Padre Pio saw him from across the courtyard of the friary? Before Antonio had spoken a word, before he had identified himself to anyone, before he had even entered the church, is something that appears in 3 separate accounts of that day, all written by different witnesses, all corroborating one another in a detail that the Vatican has never formally commented upon. Now you might think, 3 separate accounts, surely it was staged, surely it was coincidence, surely it was the kind of collective suggestibility that crowds around famous mystics create. Those are reasonable thoughts. I held them myself for years. What eventually changed my mind was reading Father Bernardino of Siena's diary. Not a document published for devotional purposes, but a private journal that was only translated into English in the 1990s, and which contains numerous entries made in real time about Padre Pio that are remarkable precisely because they were not written for an audience. Father Bernardino was standing in the piazza on that Tuesday morning in February when Padre Pio crossed briefly from the sacristy toward the church. He describes it like this: the morning was cold and the piazza was crowded with perhaps 200 people. Padre Pio was walking with his characteristic deliberate care. The stigmata wounds made every step a quiet act of endurance, and he had given no indication of attending to the crowd. Then he stopped. He turned his head toward a section of the crowd near the eastern edge of the piazza. Father Bernardino writes that he made the sign of the cross in that direction with a gesture that the priest described, specifically and without embellishment, as not a greeting, not a blessing in the ordinary sense, but what he called an act of shelter, as if he were marking something that needed to be marked before it was too late. The tall man standing in that section of the crowd, Father Bernardino records, seemed to feel something, because he went very still in a way that was noticeable in the movement of the crowd around him. Father Bernardino did not know who this man was. He did not ask. He recorded the incident as a curiosity. That tall man was Antonio Ferrante. Maria Ferrante's diary, cross-referenced against Father Bernardino's entries, makes the identification unambiguous. The dates match, the description matches, the detail of Antonio going very still. Maria notes this explicitly in her diary. in a passage where she describes what Antonio told her about the moment he later identified as the beginning of his conversion. He said, "I saw him look at me from across the courtyard, and something in my chest went very quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before something is said that cannot be unsaid." Antonio waited in the confession line for 3 days. Those who wait for confession at San Giovanni Rotondo in those years often report a phenomenon that is difficult to account for naturalistically. A gradual intensification of self-awareness over the hours of waiting that is qualitatively different from ordinary reflection. People have described it as the noise going out of their thinking, as a stripping away, slow but persistent, of the particular internal arrangements by which we normally protect ourselves from knowing too clearly what we actually are. Antonio was not immune to this. He had not come to San Giovanni planning to feel anything in particular. He had come in the way that practically minded men sometimes come to things they have postponed long enough to feel obligated to attend to, with a sort of brisk internal efficiency. He would do this, tick this box, return to Naples. By the third morning, he had stopped thinking about Naples entirely. When Antonio entered the confessional, Padre Pio heard the first few words of his opening, the formulaic beginning of a Catholic confession, words Antonio had not spoken aloud in 11 years, and stopped him. According to both Father Bernardino's account and the testimony Maria later gave to a priest at their parish in Naples, Padre Pio said, "You have been carrying the letter for 4 months." Antonio had not mentioned the letter. Antonio's first instinct, he told Maria later, was to deny it. He was in a confessional. Denial is not available in a confessional, not because of the ritual, not because of the priest, but because something in the architecture of that space, combined with 11 years of accumulated interior weather, had already dismantled the particular form of self-protection that denial requires. He said, "Yes, Father." And Padre Pio said, "Tell me why you did not come sooner." There was a silence that lasted long enough for Father Bernardino, standing outside the confessional screen, to note it in his diary. And then Antonio Ferrante said the truest thing he had said, perhaps, in 11 years. He said, "Because I was afraid that if I came, I would have to change." I want to pause here, because in that sentence, the entire diagnosis is contained. Antonio was not afraid of Padre Pio. He was not afraid of hell in the sharp and immediate sense. He was afraid of the specific cost that genuine conversion always carries. The surrender of the version of yourself you have spent years constructing and maintaining. The comfortable identity built from the careful balance of goodness that shows and smallness that is kept quiet. Antonio had a life that worked. He was respected. He was, by any external measure, a good man, and he understood at some level he had been carefully not examining that coming to Padre Pio and confessing honestly would require him to dismantle the accounting system he had been living inside of for 11 years. To admit that the charitable donations did not cancel the communions received unworthily. To admit that God's patience was not the same as God's approval. He had delayed for 4 months, not from cowardice exactly, but from the quite rational recognition that genuine conversion is not costless. What Padre Pio said next is the reason this story has remained with me for over 20 years since I first encountered it. Because instead of moving immediately toward comfort, instead of rushing to the consolation of absolution, he asked Antonio a question that cut to the center of the spiritual problem he had been watching develop in souls for half a century. He asked, "And what are you afraid of now? Losing what you have or losing what you are about to lose forever?" Stay with me, because Antonio's answer, and what Padre Pio saw in his soul at that moment, is the fulcrum of the entire story. The distinction Padre Pio was drawing is precise in a way that popular religious language has largely lost the habit of making. In the Catholic tradition of spiritual theology, there are two kinds of contrition, and the difference between them is not merely technical. Attrition, imperfect contrition, is sorrow for sin, motivated primarily by fear of consequences. You are sorry because you are afraid of hell. You are sorry because you can see what you are about to lose. This is valid. The Church accepts it. Padre Pio heard thousands of confessions from people who came with nothing more than this, and he did not send them away. God's grace can work with fear. Fear can be the beginning of wisdom. But it is only the beginning. Perfect contrition is something different. In perfect contrition, the soul is sorry not because of what it fears losing, but because it has genuinely understood what it has already done, what it has done to love itself. The grief is not self-referential. It is not about the soul's own fate. It is about God, about the relationship damaged, the truth avoided, the repeated small refusals accumulated into something that has changed the interior landscape of the soul over years. And the terrible truth about deathbed conversion, the truth that Padre Pio spent 50 years watching unfold with his own eyes, is this: the capacity for perfect contrition is not a static endowment given at baptism and simply retrieved at will whenever the moment of death arrives. It is a living capacity that must be exercised to remain strong, that atrophies when it is not used, and that can, in extreme cases, become so weakened by sustained neglect that the final moment of death finds it nearly inaccessible, not unavailable, nearly inaccessible. Padre Pio said it directly in a letter to Father Agostino that was published after his death. The heart that has never bent toward God in life will not easily bend toward Him in death. It can, I have seen it happen, and the grace of God is capable of anything, but not easily, and not without a cost to the soul that is very difficult to describe to those who have not seen it from the side I have seen it from. That phrase, the side I have seen it from, is worth sitting with. Padre Pio had seen what happens to souls at and after death in ways that no ordinary priest has seen. He was not speaking theoretically. He was not drawing conclusions from premises. He was reporting what he had directly witnessed, the particular agony of souls who arrived at the moment of death with a capacity for contrition that years of deliberate delay had diminished almost to nothing. Almost to nothing, not to nothing entirely. Because here is where the story of Antonio Ferrante takes a turn that is both comforting and sobering in equal measure. Antonio's answer to Padre Pio's question, "What are you afraid of now? Losing what you have, or losing what you are about to lose forever?" was this: "I don't know." Not a dramatic declaration of conversion, not a sudden, tearful profession of faith, simply the most honest thing a man in his position could say. "I don't know." I have been operating in a framework that has made this question difficult to answer. I don't know which fear is the real one. And Padre Pio told him. This is recorded in Maria's diary, in a passage she wrote several days after Antonio returned from San Giovanni and told her what had happened in the confessional. That this answer, this bare and undefended not knowing, was the only opening the grace of God had found in 11 years. Not the charitable donations, not the Sunday attendance, not even the carrying of the letter for 4 months. The honesty of a man who finally stopped managing his self-presentation long enough to say, "I don't know." The confession lasted 40 minutes. Those waiting outside noticed. Father Bernardino noted it. When Antonio emerged, Father Bernardino wrote that he looked like a man who had been somewhere very far away and was not entirely certain yet what country he had returned to. He lit a candle at the altar of Our Lady of Grace. He sat in the church without moving for over an hour. That night, in the room at the modest hotel near the friary where he was staying, Antonio wrote Maria a letter. In it, He asked her forgiveness, not in the general and easily spoken way of a man apologizing for a temperamental failing. He named things, specific things, 11 years of specific things, the precise inventory of a man who has finally decided to keep honest accounts. Maria received the letter 2 days after returning to Naples. She stood at the kitchen table to read it, the same spot where she had read Padre Pio's letter 6 months before. She would say, many years later, that the 2 letters felt like 2 parts of a single thing, a diagnosis and a cure, both written in some sense by the same hand. But now I need to tell you the part of Antonio Ferrante's story that the comfortable version always leaves out. Because this story does not end in simple triumph, and Padre Pio's warning does not end with one man's conversion. The warning extends further, and its full weight requires that we follow Antonio to the end of his story. Antonio returned to the sacraments. He went to confession monthly and more frequently during Lent. He completed a pilgrimage to Lourdes that he had been postponing for 15 years. He rearranged certain business dealings that had been troubling his conscience in ways he had not previously been willing to examine. By every account available to us, his wife's diary, the testimony of their parish priest, a brief mention in a letter from Father Bernardino, who later encountered Antonio again in Naples, the last 7 years of his life were genuinely, structurally different from the first 56. He died in 1962 at the age of 63. His death was not sudden. He had a progressive illness that gave him several months of clear forewarning. His final hours, according to the parish priest who administered the last rites, were characterized by a quality of peace that the priest described in his own notes as the death of a man who had made his peace with every inch of himself. The priest wrote, "A soul that had learned in its final years how to bend." That is a beautiful ending, and it would be very easy to stop there, to let the story close with the implication even 11 years of absence can be repaired. Padre Pio's intercession works. The door of mercy is real, and it is open. All of that is true. But here is what Padre Pio said, not in Antonio's story, but in explicit terms throughout his ministry, to spiritual directors, in private correspondence, in the long, dark conversations he had in the night hours with the young friars under his guidance. He said, Antonio was fortunate. He was fortunate in ways that most people who tell themselves his story will not be. Antonio had a wife whose love was strong enough and honest enough to write a difficult letter. He had a saint alive who received and answered that letter. He had a dream, 4 months of carrying that dream, a conviction that eventually overcame his resistance. He had 40 months of warning, time enough barely to do the interior work that genuine conversion requires. Most people who wait until the deathbed do not get 40 months. Most people who wait until the deathbed get 4 hours or 4 days, during which they are too ill and too medicated to do the kind of sustained interior work that Antonio did over 7 years. Or they get no warning at all. A cardiac arrest at home on a Tuesday afternoon, a fall, an accident on an ordinary road. They get the deathbed without the extended grace of its approach. And in those final hours or minutes, what does the soul have available to it? It has what it has practiced. It has the degree of suppleness or rigidity that years of daily choices have produced. It has, in Padre Pio's language, either a heart that knows how to bend or a heart that has forgotten how. I've seen it with my own eyes, and I do not say this lightly. During the 12 years I spent as a hospital visitor for the Catholic chaplaincy in Coventry, walking the wards alongside the priests, sitting with people who were dying across a wide range of faiths and backgrounds and life stories, I watched many people die. I watched the ones who died with what I can only describe as a quality of arrival. People who, despite pain, despite fear, despite the very legitimate terror of ceasing to exist, managed to open, to receive, to be genuinely present to the grace that the sacraments offer. And I watched, not all, not even most, but some, of the ones who had always said later, later, later struggle in a way that had a different texture from ordinary dying fear. It was not the fear of death. It was the bewilderment of a soul facing the most important interior act of its existence and discovering that the muscles required for that act had never been properly developed. This is the reversal that Padre Pio tried to communicate across 50 years of ministry, the reversal of the common assumption. The common assumption runs like this: God's mercy is available at the last second. A deathbed conversion is as valid as a conversion made at 30. All that is required is a sincere word, and everything is resolved. This assumption is true in its essentials. God's mercy is infinite, and a genuine act of contrition at the final moment can indeed save a soul. The Church teaches this clearly. Padre Pio never contradicted it, but Padre Pio knew something that this comfortable formulation leaves out. He knew that the capacity for a genuine act of contrition, one that is not merely mechanical, not merely a frightened man covering his bets, but a true interior movement of the soul toward God, is something that must be cultivated. It is not simply switched on at will in the last moments of life. And the soul that has spent 60 years systematically avoiding the cultivation of this capacity, choosing itself over God in 10,000 small decisions, has not simply preserved the option of conversion for later. It has, in varying degrees depending on the individual, been diminishing that option, narrowing it, making it harder and harder to access. Not impossible. The grace of God is capable of anything, and Padre Pio knew this better than anyone, but harder, at genuine spiritual cost. The soul that waits too long may find that it no longer knows how to walk through it. He was describing the soul. He was not predicting what God would or would not do. He was describing what decades of deliberate delay do to the interior mechanism of surrender. The good news, and this must be said, is that this mechanism can be restored. This is what the sacramental life of the Church exists to do. Confession is not just the removal of guilt. It is an exercise of the soul's capacity for surrender. Every genuine confession strengthens it. Every sincere act of contrition is, in a very literal sense, a practice session, a daily rehearsal for the one performance that will matter most. Now I'm going to tell you what to do, not in vague terms, not as a general spiritual encouragement. I'm going to tell you the specific practice that Padre Pio taught to those he identified as falling into Antonio's trap. People of good outward lives who were developing, without realizing it, a dangerous interior rigidity. He called it the daily examination of conscience, and he insisted on it with a particular emphasis that distinguished his teaching from the standard catechetical treatment of the practice. It has 3 parts, and all 3 must be done together, in order, each evening before sleep. The first part is the account. You look back over the day with specificity, not in general, not in the impressionistic way we usually review ourselves. A vague sense of whether the day was good or bad, a rough feeling of whether we behaved decently. You name specific things, the conversation where you were impatient and knew it, the moment where you could have been generous and chose comfort instead, the prayer shortened because you were tired, the small resentment that you fed rather than released, the act of ordinary kindness that you considered doing and decided against. You name these things specifically, the way you would name items on a list, because naming them is not about self-punishment. Naming them is about honesty, and honesty with yourself is the precondition for the kind of honesty with God that genuine contrition requires. Padre Pio told Cleonice Morcaldi, one of his closest spiritual daughters, whose correspondence with him runs to hundreds of letters, God already knows what is on the list. You are not informing him. You are practicing the act of seeing yourself clearly. And the soul that practices seeing itself clearly each evening will not be surprised by death, because death is the moment when all self-deception is removed. And for the soul that has been practicing honesty, that removal is a homecoming rather than a catastrophe. The second part is the sorrow. After naming the specifics, you sit with them 5 minutes, not a lengthy torture session, but genuinely. You do not rush from the naming to the prayer, the way a man goes to the doctor, hears the diagnosis, and immediately starts discussing his schedule. You allow what you have named to be real. You allow the gap between what you have done and what you are called to be to actually register in the interior life of the soul, rather than immediately covering it with a quick prayer and the comfortable sense of having completed a religious task. This is the part Padre Pio said most people skip. It is uncomfortable. It requires a quality of honest self-knowledge that most of our daily arrangements are organized to prevent. But it is the hinge of the whole practice, because the sorrow that is brief and unexamined is not contrition. It is self-management dressed in religious language. And the soul that practices self-management dressed in religious language for 40 years will arrive at the deathbed with nothing but self-management dressed in religious language. And it will wonder why the words that should open the door seem to produce nothing in the way of actual opening. The third part is the resolution, not a general promise to be better, but a particular and nameable decision. Tomorrow, in that specific situation, I will respond differently. Tomorrow, I will not shorten the rosary. Tomorrow, I will make that phone call. One specific resolution, concrete enough to recognize tomorrow evening whether you kept it or did not. This practice, done consistently every evening, has a cumulative effect that Padre Pio described in multiple accounts of his spiritual direction. The closest translation I have found is this: it keeps the heart supple. It keeps the door, the interior door, the soul's own door toward God, from becoming so fixed by years of inaction that the final moment of life finds it immovable. Let me tell you something most people do not realize. Every single day you are practicing for the moment of your death. You are training a response. You are either training the soul's capacity for surrender, for honesty, for the humility of seeing itself clearly and turning toward God, or you are training its capacity for self-management, comfortable deferral, and the quiet assumption that the accounting can always be pushed to a later period. Padre Pio sat in that confessional for 50 years, and he watched both kinds of soul approach him. He knew the difference the moment a person walked through the door. Not because he judged them. His love for souls was one of the most consistently documented features of his entire ministry. But because he saw clearly, and because he loved clearly, he refused to offer the comfortable answer when the honest answer was what the soul actually needed. Antonio Ferrante was fortunate. He had 40 months and a wife who loved him, and a saint who responded to her letter. He had time enough to develop, in the last 7 years of his life, a heart that knew how to bend. And when his moment came, the bending was available to him because he had practiced it. You have this moment, this awareness that is stirring in you right now as you listen to these words, this particular unease or recognition or quiet urgency that is the sound of grace asking for your attention. Do not put it down when the screen goes dark. The final warning Padre Pio left for those who wait until the deathbed is not a warning about death. Death will come when it comes, and nothing you do can change that. The warning is about life, about every ordinary evening when the examination of conscience takes 5 minutes and you choose the television instead. About every Lent when you mean to return to monthly confession and the weeks pass. About every morning when you know that a particular relationship, a particular resentment, a particular habit is growing a scar inside you, and you choose the comfort of the known rather than the cost of the honest. You have today. You have this evening, you have the practice that Padre Pio taught because he had seen what happens without it, in living souls and in the souls of the dead who came to him in the night asking for prayers, asking for the intercession they had deferred too long to ask for while they were alive. The door has always been open. The question Padre Pio spent his life asking is not whether the door is open, it is whether you still know how to walk through it. You have just spent this time hearing something that is rarely said in the form it has been said here today, not because it is not true, but because it is uncomfortable in ways that make it easier to leave for another time. The truth that the capacity for repentance can be diminished, not by God, but by us, is not a popular message. Padre Pio preached it anyway, to everyone who came to him, because he understood what was at stake. Not the comfort of his listeners, their souls. If this video has reached you at the right moment, if there is a name that came to mind while you were listening, a confession that has been waiting, a door you have been walking past for months or years, then I want to ask you to let that recognition be real, to sit with it tonight, the way the daily examination asks you to sit with what you have named. The super thanks button below this video helps this channel continue bringing the honest teachings of Padre Pio to those who need them. Not to those who want comfort, but to the woman who has not been to confession in 15 years, to the man quietly building his ledger and trusting that Padre Pio is taking care of it, to every soul sitting in the waiting room of their own life. You are not just a viewer here. You are a guardian of truths that Padre Pio communicated across 50 years of ministry at great personal cost. Every contribution sends those truths one step further, becomes a letter, like the one Maria sent to San Giovanni Rotondo, that might reach the person who needs it before their 40 days run out. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever sat with someone in their final hours and witnessed what I've been describing, the struggle or the peace of a soul arriving at that final door? Or perhaps there is something in your own life that this video has moved, a recognition, a decision that has been waiting. Write ready in the comments below if you are committing today, not tomorrow, to begin the daily examination of conscience that Padre Pio taught. 3 parts. Every evening, 5 minutes. Account, sorrow, resolution. The practice that keeps the heart supple. The practice that means that when your moment comes, and it will come as it came for Antonio Ferrante, as it comes for all of us, you will not be standing at the door wondering why you have forgotten how to open it. And if this video found you at precisely the moment you needed it, tell me that too. Padre Pio believed that nothing arrives by accident. I believe he is still sending letters.